Hi. Our first speaker today will be Dr. Sarah Zemore from University of California, Berkeley. Been doing work on treatment seeking and AA and other mutual help groups. They're helping and spiritual race and other disparities in use and treatment. She recently edited one of the sections in the recent developments in alcohol research, which is a expensive but tome worth checking out of the library. And she writes music, and she's Canadian. She's going to speak on Alcoholics Anonymous effectiveness for science.
Okay, so the title of the talk is AA Effectiveness, Faith Meets Science. And so why is the talk called this? Well, faith comes into play in a couple ways in relation to AA. It comes into play sometimes in people's opinions about whether AA really works. Sometimes AA members think, oh yeah, I know it works. I don't need any evidence to substantiate that. It worked for me, it's got to work. Sometimes people on the other side, the critics, also have a lot of faith in their position. They think, oh, AA couldn't possibly work, particularly because of the faith element. A lot of people react negatively to the spiritual emphasis. And, you feel that if you go to an AA meeting, it's in 7 of the 12 steps. There's a reference to God or a higher power. So there's no denying that that's an important part of AA. But we do need to pay attention to the empirical evidence on this program. It's actually kind of confusing. People have come to very different conclusions looking at that evidence. For example, the Cochrane Review, which is a very famous group who do a lot of reviews of the literature in science, came to the conclusion that there was no experimental evidence for AA's efficacy. They said included studies did not allow a conclusive assessment of the effect of 12-step facilitation in promoting complete abstinence, and that people considering attending AA or TSF programs, that's 12-step facilitation, should be made aware that there's a lack of experimental evidence on the effectiveness of such programs. And then on the other hand, Rudy Moose, who's an AA researcher, says you need to send people to AA first instead of treatment. Our findings imply that counselors and information and referral programs and detox centers should consider initially referring individuals interested in obtaining treatment for their alcohol-related problems to AA rather than to treatment. So I thought it worked so well that you should just go there first instead of treatment. So what is the actual evidence on this? Well, a good framework for thinking about the evidence is this framework that was set. Actually, this was Sir Bradford Hill in the 60s who initially set this up. Master and Kramer expanded this more recently. But the idea is that there are 6 criteria for establishing causation. And we'll go through the evidence in relation to each of these criteria. So the first one is strength of association. The idea here is that if 2 things are causally related, then you should see that there's a strong association between them. Obviously. So if AA is related to recovery outcomes, then those things should be related. Well, what is the evidence on this? If you look at the wealth of studies, particularly observational studies, you find a very consistent and strong association between going to AA and abstinence-related outcomes. So I'm going to be showing you a number of slides here, and generally what we have here is a description of the sample on the left here. The authors are on the right, and then we're looking at the outcome here and AA involvement down here, or whatever other independent variable. But you can see that in this case, so there's 2 follow-up points. One is 1 year after treatment here in green, and the other is at 18 months. And folks who went to AA at 1 year, so nearly 50% of them were absent compared to about 25% of those who didn't go to AA in the study of a treatment population. So clear, and this is something that you see again and again in observational studies of AA, and probably a lot of you are quite familiar with this stuff. Here's another one by Timko, Christine Timko. This is a VA study. A lot of these studies come out of the VA, so looking at men. And here you find that, so folks who are not getting any treatment are not doing well at all. Treatment only is a little bit better, and generally AA plus treatment works better than just AA alone or treatment alone. It's not true in every case, but generally that is what you find in the literature, is that that combination works better than treatment or AA alone, so that's something to keep in mind. If you're interested in this literature, reviews by Chad Emick and Scott Tonigan are good places to look at summaries of that evidence. So we have a strong association. What about a dose-response relationship? Well, if going to AA is effective, you should see that going to no meetings is not good, going to some meetings is better, going to a lot of meetings is the best, right? And that's what you find here. So this is a study by Moose and colleagues, and it's pretty linear. And, this is generally what you find. There have been a number of studies that have found this exact relationship. So 0 meetings, you're not doing so well. 1 to 19, you're better, and so on up to 50-plus meetings in this 3-month time period. So there are some sort of quirks in that relationship, though. One of them is that there seem to be threshold effects, which is kind of interesting. So this is a study by Fiorentino et al., and this has also been found in a set of studies where you find that at least weekly attendance is important to obtaining effects for AA. So people need to go pretty consistently and pretty often in order to get effects. Less than weekly is that's not very good. Okay, this is a study this is a sort of another interesting finding that's a qualification on this dose-response relationship. So this is a study that Lee Keskus did. And she was looking at AA trajectories. So if you look at, basically there's a computer program that allows you to sort of divide variation in AA attendance into groups, so that you put people into groups depending on what their pattern of involvement is. And then you can look at how their membership in these different groups relates to their recovery-related outcomes, their abstinence. And so what you find is there are a number of different sort of trajectories. You can get high, medium, and low, which is pretty obvious, AA, but then you also get this declining group who starts early and then goes down over a 5-year time span. What she found was really interesting. So she found that this declining group actually had benefits that lasted through 5 years, even though they dropped off. If you remember, in terms of attendance, they dropped way down by 5 years. So again, this is a qualification on the dosage effect. So if you get a lot of AA early on, you can be seeing effects pretty far out. And of course, this is the dosage, the typical dosage thing: high, medium, and low AA. I guess this is high, medium, and low, and no AA clearly are related to gradations in odds of abstinence. Okay, so another criterion is consistency of association. So if AA is generally, if AA is truly related to higher odds of abstinence, we should see this across studies and across samples. People often think about this in terms of across different kinds of people. So what do we find here? I've been talking a lot about VA samples. So the question is, does this apply outside the VA? Does it apply to women? Does it apply to general population samples? This is a NESARC study, and indeed we find that, even in the general population, going to AA is related to better recovery outcomes. So this is odds of abstinence. Here we find that, 12-step treatment only is better than 12-step plus treatment. Again, that's sort of unusual. Usually you find that the combination is best, and it could be that confounds help explain that relationship. Maybe these guys are a little bit more severe in ways that, weren't measured and weren't controlled for, and/or weren't controlled for. So. Another way of thinking about consistency is consistency across time. This is a really interesting study by Cross and colleagues, and they looked at the effects of AA involvement over time. Essentially, they assessed AA involvement immediately post-treatment, and they found that that variable predicted abstinence 10 years later. In fact, that was the only variable that they measured post-treatment or at baseline that did predict abstinence 10 years later. Treatment length of stay was not significant in that study. So it was quite a powerful effect. And having a sponsor was a particularly important part of going to AA. So that's something that comes up in a lot of literature as well. Having a sponsor seems to be really important. Okay, so the fourth criterion is this temporally correct association. So this is something that critics quite often jump on. So the idea is that, okay, we know that AA is associated with higher odds of abstinence, right? People who go to AA are more likely to be sober. Well, maybe it's just that you get sober, so you're able to keep going to AA. It's reverse causation, right? It's not that AA is causing sobriety, it's that sobriety is causing AA. So here, one way of looking at that is statistically, so doing statistical modeling. And this is a study by Weiss and colleagues. And basically, so they're just lagging time points here. They're looking at meetings and activities in months 1 to 3, and then alcohol and drug use in months 4 to 6. And they find that indeed, if you lag stuff, you get a significant association. Another interesting thing about the study is that activities are significant predictors of sobriety outcomes, but not meetings when both are entered into the equation simultaneously. And what that means is, if you account for the activities that people are doing in AA, the meetings don't matter, right? So activities are really important, and this is something that you've actually seen in a couple of studies. So it's important not to just go and occupy chairs in AA. You need to actually be getting involved in the activities. Here's another lag study. This is AA involvement between months 1 and 6, and then percentage days abstinent between months 7 and 12, and you find, yes, there's a significant relationship. Okay, one problem, there is a problem with this, right? Because, it could be that AA involvement at this time point is correlated with percentage days abstinent at this time point, right? And it's actually sobriety that's causing AA involvement here. And then these things are sort of spuriously related. So it's tricky, just lagging it doesn't quite do it, but there's an analysis that you can do called cross-lag panel analysis, which a couple of folks have done, including John Keller, and I'm not going to get into that here, but that helps establish that there is indeed a temporal relationship between these two, that AA involvement precedes sobriety outcomes, so you can look that up. So doing pretty good on that criterion. Okay, specificity of the association. Okay, this is another one that critics often point to. This is an important one, really. The idea here is that the association between AA involvement and better outcomes should be, you shouldn't be able to explain that via confounds, via some other variable. So a lot of critics will say, okay, people who go to AA have better outcomes because they're more motivated, or they're more psychologically healthy, or they, don't have a severe problem as people who don't go to AA. Is that the case? Well, one really good way of looking at this is just randomizing to AA, and that's what a number of studies have done. Actually, there are only 3 studies that have randomized directly to AA, and these studies are unfortunately sort of problematic. We need more of this kind of study. There's one major problem with these studies, which is that they have all involved either drunk driving offenders or folks who were EAP referred, so they were referred by their employers. So very, very sort of narrow samples, very small studies. But let's go over the results anyway. This is a study by Walsh et al., and this is the most recent one. People sometimes say, look, AA doesn't work. Hospital inpatient is doing better than just going to AA, or having your choice between going to AA or hospital inpatient. Well, the problem with this study is that what do you think the people on the hospital inpatient condition were doing? They were going to AA, right? And also there's no treatment condition, so there's no comparison point. So not such a great study. This is the Dittman study. This is the first one that was done. These are, chronic drunk offenders. They were drunk drivers. Essentially, there was AA alone, an alcoholism clinic, and no treatment. These guys didn't measure, alcohol use outcomes, so it's hard to know really what happened here. They were just looking at rates of rearrest, and those were equivalent across condition. Also a very small study. And then this Bransma study is the last one, and again, these were drunk driving offenders. There were 3 conditions, AA alone. This is like rational behavioral therapy, sort of like CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, and no treatment. So, and this is sort of equivocal. AA alone was similar to RBT in most outcomes. Folks in the AA condition were slightly more likely to binge at 3 months. There was no difference at 12 months. But, this is a huge problem here because folks were discarded from the study for exceeding the maximum amount of treatment. They defined there was a certain maximum treatment you could get. Well, if you look at the folks in the AA condition, most of them were discarded. So, they were getting too much treatment. So only the folks who didn't really like AA that much were included, and there were only 12 of them. So we really just don't know what's going on from these randomized trials. Another thing you can do is you can randomize to TSF, which is 12-step facilitation, which means it's a treatment that's oriented to encourage people to attend AA, basically. So it's sort of another way of, it's an indirect randomization to AA, really. And so this is something that probably a lot of people know. Project Match, they looked at whether 12-step facilitation was better than, some pretty standard and widely esteemed alternatives such as motivational enhancement therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy. And you find that it did better at 1 year and 3-year follow-ups in the outpatient sample. So that was they had basically 2 study wings, outpatient and aftercare. So that's looking pretty good for AA. The aftercare, basically there was nothing for treatment there, and so that doesn't look as good for AA. On the other hand, if you look at AA attendance rates, the thing is that people in the aftercare condition were going to a lot of AA across the board. And so there are kind of ceiling effects there, right? I mean, encouraging people to go to AA is not going to do anything if they're already going to AA. These folks had a lot of inpatient care. These folks were recruited after 4 weeks of inpatient care. So here the difference is much clearer, right? This is the outpatient, and this is the TSF condition, and clearly it's higher. There's higher rates of AA attendance in that condition. If you look at AA involvement within each of those conditions, it's also related to outcomes, to better outcomes. So. Another thing you can do to look at these confounds is you can do some statistical modeling. Even if you have an observational study, you can basically just control for motivation, control for psychopathology, or sort of do a more complicated model. But this is a model by McKellar and colleagues, and so they were looking at, does higher motivation or lower psychopathology explain why folks who go to AA have better outcomes? Well, it doesn't seem to here. In fact, they found a negative relationship between higher motivation and going to AA. So folks who are less motivated to change were going to AA. That's kind of weird. It doesn't usually happen that way. But psychopathology, there was no difference. I think that's quite typical. But in any case, clearly in this study, those variables don't explain the relationship between AA involvement and alcohol problems because of these relationships. With the motivation piece, a number of studies have controlled for motivation assessed with stuff like the stage of change scales, the Eureka. We've done that. It makes no difference. We might not be, measuring motivation adequately. That's an issue, but we're sort of doing the best we can. And, the relationship is really robust. Okay, the last criterion is consistency of association, and I should have said this. If things aren't clear, you can stop me. I'm going pretty fast here because there's a lot to cover, but we can also talk after. So this criterion is really about, do the results fit with, so does the relationship between AA and better recovery outcomes fit with what we know about the world? Does it fit with theory? Does it fit with just general common sense? Does it seem plausible? And, so here's a way of thinking about it. There are sort of 3 main psychosocial theories that have been applied to human behavior: cognitive behavioral, social learning, and psychodynamic. This isn't really a scientific theory, but it's a way of thinking about human behavior. So in cognitive behavioral theory, you identify the problem as drinking as a habit, and then the solution is to develop drink refusal skills, develop emergency plans, identify alternative behaviors, and develop self-efficacy. In social learning, okay, you're drinking because you're in social networks that are drinking a lot, you're getting cued by the environment, so you change your networks, you change your cues. Psychodynamic theory, you have needs that aren't getting met, so you're drinking to address those, so you've got to address the needs in a different way. And then, this is something that's, the spiritual sort of thinking is something that's prominent in AA, and the idea is that you're drinking because something wrong with your spiritual condition, so that's what you need to change. And really, you can think about what happens in AA in terms of each of these different theories, and you can see how the different aspects of AA can be helpful conceptualized according to these different theories. So, for example, when you go to meetings, you're avoiding going to a bar. So, that fits with cognitive behavioral therapy. It's an alternative thing that you might do other than drink. You're also changing your cues, your environmental cues, and so additionally, you're talking about your problems, which is maybe addressing a psychological need. You're hearing that others had similar experiences to you and succeeded, so that's developing your self-efficacy. You're developing coping strategies, and your mood changes, and you avoid drinking for that day. Avoiding drinking is one way to develop your self-efficacy. And similarly, thinking about the sort of social networks piece in AA, the friendship piece, by going to AA, you add sober people to your network, generate new role models, and going to AA helps you learn how to have sober fun. So all of these sort of fit into these three major theories that we were talking about in terms of providing you new role models, for example, alternatives to drinking. I'm not going to go through all the examples here, but you can sort of just think about the different aspects of AA and see how that might work. Studies have also modeled these mechanisms of action, and many of those studies, support the idea that there is some theoretical rationale for why AA works. Okay, you can hook this up to some sort of overarching theory. For example, John Morgenstern, Dr. Kelly has also looked at this stuff. These are some cognitive changes that you see in association with going to AA. So people who go to AA tend to develop higher self-efficacy and better coping skills, and people have actually measured this, and that helps explain why AA involvement is related to higher odds of abstinence. Consistent with social learning theory, we've also looked at changes in social networks and found that those changes help explain why AA involvement is related to higher odds of abstinence. Lee Cascudis has done a lot of work here, also Keith Humphreys and Christine Timko. So when you go to AA, you end up with fewer pro-drinking influences in your networks, better friendship quality, more friends, and more support for abstinence from AA in particular. And actually it's interesting because Lee has shown that having support for abstinence from AA is particularly important, right? So having support for abstinence in general is good, but it's best when it comes from AA. And that may relate to the coping skills piece, that folks in AA sort of know how to cope with their desires to drink. So that kind of support is particularly good. There's also been some work on these sort of psychodynamic mechanisms, life meaning, motivation for abstinence. Dr. Lade has looked at that, as well as Dr. Kelly. And then this is something that I've worked on. There should be a lot more names on this slide, actually, because I know that several people in this room have looked at the role of spiritual change in mediating AA's efficacy, and I'm really fascinated by this sort of stuff. People who go to AA do report changes in their religious beliefs and behaviors, and many of them report a spiritual awakening. And then if you look at those variables, they do help explain the relationship. So it's really unclear to me still what it means to have a spiritual awakening, and that's something that we can talk about. But it does seem to be related to better outcomes. Okay, so sort of summing up the evidence. Generally, it looks like we have evidence for all the different criteria. I think the evidence is somewhat weaker on specificity of the association. So in other words, I think it's it would still be a leap to say that we could rule out all those potential confounds. So, I think we haven't fully ruled out, motivation to change. That may explain some of the relationship between AA involvement and recovery outcomes. I think we need more randomized studies, and hopefully we'll see that in the future. I talked a little bit about TSF interventions, 12-step facilitation interventions. I did want to mention that our group has actually developed one, and we, consistent with good effects for AA involvement, we did find that folks who received the intervention did better than the usual care condition. And this manual on the intervention is available, and you can get it just by emailing Lee. So if people are interested in implementing this in their programs or learning more about the research on this intervention, then please email us. We're very grateful to get support from various sources, so we'd like to acknowledge those sources here. And that's my cat. So yeah, I really went quickly there, so hopefully it wasn't too quickly. Yeah.
Did you look at folks who were going to AA and how they were able to adjust without higher power?
That's an interesting question. Yeah, I mean, in our study in particular, or I mean, generally, folks who are atheists do as well in AA as folks who come in identifying as spiritual or religious. So, I mean, it's interesting. So, I mean, that says to me that the spiritual change piece is important, but it's not necessary. Or that spiritual change can mean something besides identifying with a traditional God. So, yeah, I'm interested in that piece. But it does seem, I mean, folks who are atheists are less likely to go and stick with it. So that's something that, we need to think about. But yeah, it seems to be equally effective.
Maybe the specificity of association, and you were talking about McKellar and how we look at psychopathology. One of the problems with that, too, is that the guidelines for treatment referral suggested that those people with a problem with psychopathology not go to 12-step treatment, and that was for some time.
Yeah, I mean, the evidence on that has been sort of confusing because there are mixed results. I think what I've come to from reviewing that work is that folks who really have, psychotic tendencies or, are just very far out on the continuum, yeah, AA is not a good idea for them. But, I mean, for folks who are depressed or anxious, it seems to work equally well. So, yeah. Oh, yeah. Libby is nodding, so yeah. Okay, so it'll be downloadable from the website, so yeah, that's good to know. Okay, good, thanks very much.